The silence in the private dining room of Callaway's on East 57th Street was the kind that happens when something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong for someone who deserved it. Leonard Voss had just finished speaking. The words were still hanging in the air, sharp and deliberate as broken glass, directed at the young woman in the black server's uniform who was crouching on the floor, gathering the shards of a shattered ramekin with her bare hands. A few of the executives near the far end of the table had the decency to look away. Most did not. Callaway's was not the kind of restaurant where things like this happened. It occupied the 41st floor of a Manhattan high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that glittered with a cold, indifferent beauty. The kitchen held 2 Michelin stars. The sommelier had written a book. The tablecloths were changed between every course. It was the kind of place where a bottle of water cost $14 and nobody blinked. Tonight it had been reserved in its entirety for Voss Industries' annual directors' dinner. 14 men and 3 women seated around a single long table of black walnut, celebrating a fiscal year that had made each of them considerably richer, while a workforce of 1,200 people in a textile plant in rural Georgia had been handed termination notices the previous Thursday. Leonard Voss sat at the head of the table. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular brand of confidence that accumulates in men who have never once in their adult lives been told no and believed it. He wore a charcoal chiton suit. His watch was a platinum Vacheron Constantin. He had been profiled twice in Fortune and once in Architectural Digest, the latter because of a ski chalet in Telluride that had cost more to furnish than most Americans earn in a lifetime. He had been holding court all evening, the way he always did, and the evening had been going smoothly until the ramekin. It had been a small accident. The kind that happens in the final stretch of a long dinner service when a server is carrying too much and the floor manager is cutting staff costs. A ramekin of warm gougères had slipped from the edge of an overloaded tray and hit the marble floor beside Leonard Voss's chair with a sound that made 3 people flinch. The server had immediately gone to her knees. Her name was Claudia Barre. She was 28 years old. She had worked the floor at Callaway's for 11 months, and in that time had never broken so much as a bread plate. She was the best server on the floor by a margin that her colleagues both acknowledged and resented, because Claudia moved through a dining room the way very few people move through anything, with a quiet, unshakable fluency that looked effortless and was anything but. But Leonard Voss didn't know any of that. What he saw was a young woman in a black uniform crouching at his feet, and that was apparently sufficient information. Clumsy, he said. Not to her specifically. To the table, the way a man reads a headline aloud to no one in particular. You'd think they could hire people with functional motor skills. Then again. He lifted his wine glass, swirled it, set it back down. Some people aren't designed for precision. They're designed for the floor. A few people laughed. The hollow, careful laughter of people who work for a man they fear. Claudia kept her eyes down. Her hands were steady as she gathered the broken ceramic. She had learned, in the 11 months at Callaway's and in the 3 years of service work before that, how to make herself very small and very still when men like Leonard Voss decided she was useful as an object of amusement. She had learned that responding made it worse. That silence was the fastest path back to invisibility. She was almost finished when Voss spoke again. "What's your name?" She looked up for the first time. "Claudia, Claudia." He repeated it with a faint, dismissive smile, the way someone repeats a word in a foreign language they have no interest in learning. "Tell me something, Claudia. What exactly did you study? In school, or did school not factor in?" The table had gone quiet. Not the polite quiet of people giving space, the watchful quiet of people who sense entertainment approaching. Claudia set the last piece of ceramic on the tray. "I studied biochemistry," she said. Her voice was even. "At Johns Hopkins." Johns Hopkins. Voss tilted his head, the way a man tilts his head when he doesn't believe something but finds it amusing. "And yet here you are." "Here I am," Claudia said. "That's either a tremendous waste," Voss continued, warming to his audience now, "or a tremendous indictment of the Johns Hopkins biochemistry program." Several people laughed harder this time, the laughter of relief, because the joke had been made and the moment had resolved itself and they could all stop holding their breath. "Although, I suppose someone has to clear the dishes. Not everyone can be built for the upper floors. Some people are built for the service entrance." Claudia was on her feet now. The tray was balanced in her hand. She looked at Leonard Voss for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to see the satisfaction sitting in his face, that particular male satisfaction of having delivered a verdict and watched it land, and then she turned and walked toward the kitchen. She did not run. She did not cry. She pushed through the swinging kitchen door and set the tray on the counter and stood with her back against the cool stainless steel of the prep station and breathed. The head chef, a compact Haitian man named Theodore, who had watched Claudia work long enough to understand what she was capable of, looked at her once and said nothing. He handed her a clean side towel. She took it and pressed it briefly against her face, and then she folded it and tucked it into her apron and went back out to the floor. That was the thing about Claudia Barre that Leonard Voss had no way of knowing. She was very good at enduring things. She had been enduring things for 6 years. 6 years ago, Claudia had been a second-year doctoral student in the biochemistry program at Johns Hopkins, funded by a merit fellowship that her department chair had described, in the letter nominating her for it, as the most competitive award the program had offered in a decade. She had been working on a thesis examining enzymatic pathways in antibiotic-resistant bacteria, research that her advisor, a quiet, exacting woman named Dr. Fenwick, had called, in her characteristically understated way, genuinely promising. Claudia had also, in her first year, placed in the final 3 of the Harrington Prize for graduate biochemical research, competing against students from MIT and Stanford who were 2 and 3 years further along in their programs. She had not won. She had gone home that night and eaten leftover rice and bean soup and felt, despite everything, an electric and uncomplicated happiness, the happiness of someone who knows exactly where they are going and cannot wait to get there. Then her mother had been diagnosed. Glioblastoma multiforme. Grade 4. The kind of brain tumor that arrives like a verdict rather than a diagnosis. Her mother, Yvette Barre, who had raised Claudia alone in a narrow row house in Baltimore, who had worked 22 years as a school librarian and read to Claudia every night until Claudia was old enough to read faster than she could, was given 8 to 14 months. She lived for 19, which was a grace, and also a financial catastrophe. The treatments that extended Yvette's life cost more than Claudia's fellowship, paid in 2 years. There were bills that arrived in envelopes. She learned to recognize without opening. There were phone calls with hospital billing departments that took place in the stairwell outside the lab because she could not do them at her desk. There was a medical debt by the time her mother died that totaled $340,000, a number so abstract it had taken Claudia several weeks to fully understand that it was real. She had left the doctoral program 6 weeks before her mother's death, not because she wanted to, because she had to be there, and because the fellowship required full-time enrollment, and because some things are larger than your plans for yourself, and love is one of them. She had intended to return. She still intended to return. That was what she told herself on the nights she came home from a double shift at Callaway's and sat at the small desk in her apartment in Astoria with her mother's old reference books stacked in the corner and her half-written thesis draft still saved in a folder she hadn't opened in 4 months. She was going to return. She just needed to clear the debt first. At the current rate, that would take approximately 9 years. So she worked. She worked doubles and holiday shifts, and she picked up catering work on her days off, and she did not complain, because complaining required energy she needed for other things. She was very good at her job, because she was very good at everything she committed herself to. That was not arrogance. It was simply a fact. The way the enzymatic pathways were a fact, observable, repeatable, indifferent to the observer's feelings about them. She went back out to the Voss table, and she served the rest of the dinner with the same quiet fluency she always had, and Leonard Voss did not look at her once for the remainder of the meal. The incident might have ended there. Then came the cognac. It was after 11. The kitchen had closed. The sommelier had gone home. Most of the Voss Industries board members were coats on and checking their phones. But Voss himself had asked for Armagnac from the reserve list, and his 3 closest lieutenants had stayed with him, the way lieutenants do, because nobody leaves until the general leaves, and Voss gave no indication of leaving. He was in an expansive mood now, emboldened by the wine and the cognac and the particular that had gone exactly as planned. He was talking about talent. He was always, Claudia had noticed over the course of the evening, finding his way back to the subject of talent, as though it were a gravitational center he could not escape. The fundamental error most people make, Voss was saying, swirling the Armagnac, is confusing effort with ability. Effort is democratic. Anyone can work hard. Ability is aristocratic. It selects. It cannot be manufactured or purchased. You either have the architecture for greatness, he tapped his temple, or you don't. Claudia was clearing the last of the dessert plates from the far end of the table. She kept her face neutral. My son went to Brown, said one of the lieutenants, a ruddy man named Galloway, who had spent most of the evening laughing at things that weren't funny. Dean's list, every semester. Brown, Voss said, in a tone that was technically not dismissive but unmistakably was. Brown is a fine institution for people who want to feel accomplished. He drank. I have a thesis on every major research development in applied biochemistry published in the last 18 months. I fund 3 labs. I know exactly what breakthrough thinking looks like, and I can tell you, it does not look like clearing dishes. He said it without looking at Claudia. But it was for her. Everyone at the table understood that, and so did she. Claudia set the dessert plates on the tray. She had done the calculation very quickly. She had done the always did calculations. She could not afford to lose this job. She could not afford a confrontation with a man who had the resources and inclination to make her life considerably more difficult. She had her mother's hospital debt and her rent and a thesis she was going to finish someday, and absolutely nothing to gain from what she was about to do. She did it anyway. Which developments? She said. Voss looked at her. It was the first time since the ramekin that he had given her his full attention. I beg your pardon? You said you've read the major research developments in applied biochemistry in the last 18 months. Claudia kept her voice level. She held the tray at her hip. I'm curious which ones you found most significant. The table went very still. Voss studied her for a moment with the expression of a man encountering something unexpected in a place where he expected nothing unexpected. Then he smiled, a slow, enjoying smile, an opportunity. Man who has been handed an opportunity, Claudia. You tested me earlier? She said. Seemed fair. Several people inhaled sharply. Galloway set down his cognac. Voss's smile did not waver. If anything, it widened. He leaned back in his chair. All right. The Park-Reinhardt synthesis pathway, published in Nature Biochemistry in February. Potential to significantly accelerate targeted antibiotic delivery. Happy? Claudia looked at him. The Park-Reinhardt paper was significant, she said, carefully. Though their delivery model has a stability problem below 37 degrees Celsius that the supplementary materials acknowledge but the abstract glosses over. They're likely aware. Second paper is probably already in review. Silence. The more consequential publication, Claudia continued, and she could hear her own voice shifting into something she hadn't used in 4 years, something that lived in the part of her brain where the thesis draft was still saved, was the O.C. Moreau preprint out of the University of Toronto in August. It's not peer-reviewed yet, which is probably why it hasn't gotten traction in the popular press. But if their replication data holds, and from the methodology, I think it will, it reframes how we think about efflux pump inhibition in gram-negative resistance strains. That's the one I'd be watching. She had not planned to say that much. She had planned to say exactly enough to make the point and stop, but the words had come out of the place where they had been sitting for 4 years, pressurized and waiting. Voss was staring at her. Where did you read the O.C. Moreau preprint? He said slowly. Biorac Civ, Claudia said. I still have journal access through a colleague who's still enrolled. You're following preprints. I was a doctoral student. She kept her voice entirely neutral. Old habits. The silence that settled over the table was different from the silences that had preceded it. The earlier silences had been the silence of people watching someone be diminished. This was the silence of people recalibrating. Voss was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the Armagnac in his glass. He looked at Claudia. His face was doing something complicated, the particular internal labor of a man who is publicly committed to a position and is now confronting evidence that the position was wrong. You said you left Johns Hopkins. My mother was ill, Claudia said. She needed care I couldn't provide from a distance, and the financial situation. She stopped. She did not owe him the rest of it. I left. I intend to go back on a server's salary. She looked at him. On whatever salary it takes. From the far end of the table, someone cleared his throat. Claudia turned. She hadn't noticed him before. Or, rather, she had noticed him the way you notice someone who is deliberately inconspicuous, who has chosen a corner seat and ordered sparingly, and contributed almost nothing to the noise of the evening. He was in his 70s, with the compact, precise bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms that required him to be very careful with his words. His name, she would learn later, was Dr. Gerald Achebe, a name she knew, in the way doctoral students in her field know certain names with a kind of reverent familiarity. Gerald Achebe had spent 30 years at the NIH before moving to a private research foundation he'd founded with a colleague. He had been one of the 4 principal architects of the antibiotic resistance framework that the WHO had adopted in 2019 and that Claudia had cited 11 times in her unfinished thesis. He had published more than 200 peer-reviewed papers. He had been Voss Industries' most reluctant and most courted potential board member for the better part of 3 years, which was the reason for his presence at a dinner he had found largely tedious. He had not found the last 4 minutes tedious. You mentioned efflux pump inhibition, Achebe said. His voice was quiet and deliberate, every word placed with care in your own research before you left. What was your angle? Claudia looked at him. Something shifted in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite grief, something in between. I was looking at competitive inhibition at the Akrab-Tolth complex, she said. specifically trying to understand why certain naturally occurring flavonoids were showing unexpected binding affinity at. She stopped herself. I'm sorry. That's probably. It's not probably anything, Achebe said. She continued. She talked for 4 minutes without stopping, which was something she had not done about her research in 4 years. She talked about the binding affinity data and the anomalies that had excited her and the methodological question she'd left unresolved when she'd had to leave. She talked about what she'd read since, patching it together from journal access borrowed through her former colleague, and from preprints, and from the stack of reference books in the corner of her apartment. In Astoria, she talked with the precision and velocity of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and has finally been. When she stopped, the table was completely silent. Achebe looked at her for a long moment. Who was your advisor? Dr. Ellen Fenwick, Claudia said. Biochemistry department. Ellen Fenwick, Achebe repeated quietly. I know Ellen. Her judgment is excellent. He turned to Leonard Voss, and his expression had changed into something that was not unkind, but was not warm either. It was the expression of a man who has reached a conclusion and sees no point in softening it. I came to this dinner, Achebe said, because your team has spent 3 years trying to lend my name to a research initiative that I have had reservations about. You used the word excellence at least 6 times this evening. Leonard, I counted. He nodded toward Claudia. This woman is what that word means. The thing you demonstrated earlier, the contempt, the performance of superiority at the expense of someone in a position that made it impossible for her to respond. He paused. That is what the absence of excellence looks like. Voss's jaw was set. The muscles in his face were doing the work of a man holding very still. She should not be clearing your dishes, Achebe said. That is not a statement about the dignity of the work. It's a statement about the waste, about what it costs all of us when people like this, he gestured toward Claudia again, are forced out of the work they were built to do because the infrastructure doesn't hold. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a card, the plain kind with nothing on it but a name and a number, and he held it out to Claudia. The Achi Foundation has 2 funded research positions opening in January, he said, both in antimicrobial resistance. The stipend is sufficient. The benefits cover dependents and medical debt repayment as part of the compensation structure. He kept the card extended. I'd like you to call the number on the left. Monday morning, if you're available. The dining room was entirely silent. 14 Voss Industries board members and 3 executives sat without moving. Claudia looked at the card. She looked at it for a long time. She took it. She didn't speak immediately, not because she didn't have words, but because certain moments require a few seconds of silence to settle into what they actually are. She held the card carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. Then she looked at Leonard Voss. He was watching her with an expression she could not fully read. Some combination of anger and something quieter, something that might, in a less defended man, have become something resembling recognition. Architecture, Claudia said. Voss blinked. What, you used that word tonight? Twice, the architecture of greatness. She held his gaze. You're right that not everyone has it. But it has nothing to do with which floor of the building you work on. She picked up the tray. She tucked the card into her apron pocket, against her chest, next to the folded side towel. She looked at Dr. Achebe and gave him a small nod, and then she turned and walked toward the kitchen through the door that swung shut behind her without a sound, leaving Leonard Voss sitting at the head of his long black walnut table in a silence that felt, to everyone in the room, like the loudest thing they had heard all night.